The air hung thick with the humidity of a summer evening as Jonathan Blake stepped out of the dimly lit community center. It had been a long day, filled with meetings, discussions, and debates about the pervasive corruption in the city's police force. Jonathan, a 52-year-old black activist, had been at the center of these discussions for years, tirelessly advocating for accountability and transparency within law enforcement. Today, he had finally compiled enough damning evidence to expose some of the worst offenders within the department. As he walked through the empty parking lot, his mind buzzed with the events of the day. His briefcase, heavy with documents and a laptop, held the key to unraveling a deeply entrenched system of corruption. He felt a surge of both triumph and trepidation. He knew the stakes were high. The evidence he had gathered, hours of testimony, video footage, and documents leaked by a whistleblower within the police department, could not only destroy careers, but send some of these officers to prison. It was no small feat for a man who had spent decades fighting against systemic injustice. But Jonathan also knew this was dangerous territory. He had made enemies, powerful ones. In the past few weeks, there had been veiled threats, ominous phone calls, and anonymous notes left on his doorstep, warning him to stay in his lane. Even so, he refused to back down. This wasn't just about him, it was about the community he had sworn to protect, and the generations of people who had suffered under the abuse of power. For Jonathan, the fight was personal, and he wasn't going to stop now, even if the threats were becoming more direct. As he reached his car, he paused for a moment, surveying the street. The flickering streetlights cast long shadows across the road, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. Something felt off. His instincts, honed through years of activism and run-ins with law enforcement, prickled at the back of his mind. He glanced around, noticing a dark sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted. It hadn't been there when he arrived at the meeting hours earlier. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his movements steady. He wasn't the kind of man to be easily rattled, but he had learned to trust his gut. Slowly, he unlocked his car, placing the briefcase on the passenger seat. His hands moved with practiced ease, but his eyes stayed on the rearview mirror, watching the dark sedan. No movement, yet something inside him told him he wasn't alone. He slid into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition, the car humming to life beneath him. The radio buzzed faintly with static before settling on a local jazz station. The smooth melodies seemed incongruent with the tension building in his chest. He hadn't driven more than a block when the headlights behind him flared to life. The sedan pulled out, following him at a measured pace. Jonathan's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time he had been followed. Over the years, as his profile had grown, so too had the scrutiny. There had been incidents, police stopping him for routine checks, cars idling outside his home late at night, unfamiliar faces lurking near his office. But this felt different. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. This was real. He made a left turn, then a right, weaving through the quiet suburban streets that led back to his neighborhood. The sedan stayed behind him, its headlights glowing ominously in the rearview mirror. Jonathan's mind raced. He couldn't afford to lead them back to his house. His wife, Maria, and his daughter were waiting for him. He couldn't risk putting them in danger. Without thinking, he made a sharp turn down a narrow alley that cut through 2 blocks of houses. The alley was barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, its cracked pavement littered with discarded trash and overgrown weeds. His heart pounded in his chest as he accelerated, hoping to lose the sedan. But as he reached the end of the alley, he saw the headlights behind him. They had followed him without hesitation. Jonathan cursed under his breath, his mind whirling as he tried to come up with a plan. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever, and calling the police was out of the question. The very people meant to protect him were the ones trying to silence him. He had to think fast. Up ahead, the road split into two directions. Jonathan made a split-second decision and turned left, heading toward an old industrial area on the outskirts of town. The warehouses were long abandoned, their rusted metal walls covered in graffiti, windows shattered and doors chained shut. It was a desolate place, far from prying eyes, a perfect spot for an ambush. As he sped down the empty street, the sedan kept pace, its headlights growing closer. Jonathan's mind was racing. He needed to do something, anything, to shake them off. He spotted an old, crumbling warehouse with a side entrance partially hidden behind a pile of debris. Without hesitation, he slammed on the brakes and swerved into the side entrance, pulling his car out of sight just as the sedan roared past. For a moment, Jonathan sat in the driver's seat, his chest heaving with adrenaline. The car had passed him, but it wouldn't be long before they realized he was gone and doubled back. He needed to move, and fast. Grabbing his briefcase, he got out of the car and slipped through the broken door of the warehouse. Inside, the building was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as he moved deeper into the shadows, his mind working overtime to figure out his next move. He knew he couldn't stay hidden for long. The people in that car, whoever they were, weren't going to stop until they found him. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires echoed outside. Jonathan ducked behind a stack of old crates, his breath shallow. The sedan had returned. Through the shattered windows, he could see the headlights sweeping across the street as the car circled back. Then, the sound of car doors slamming shut reverberated through the empty night. They were coming for him. Jonathan's pulse thundered in his ears as he clutched the briefcase tightly. This was it, the moment he had feared for weeks. He wasn't just being followed anymore. They were coming to silence him, once and for all. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Jonathan crouched behind the stack of crates, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to steady his nerves. The dim light filtering through the broken windows cast long shadows across the vast, empty space of the warehouse. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last as he listened to the approaching footsteps outside. Whoever these people were, they were close now, closer than they had ever been before. His mind raced. What should he do? He could hear their voices, muffled by the thick walls of the warehouse, but growing louder with every passing second. They weren't just following him anymore, they had made their move. This wasn't intimidation. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Jonathan knew that if he didn't act quickly, there might be no way out of this. The warehouse was large, but not large enough to stay hidden for long. He looked around for another exit, anything that could give him a way out, but the place was a maze of rusted metal, broken machinery, and crumbling walls. Escape didn't seem like an option. Not now. As he weighed his options, Jonathan heard a sound that sent a chill down his spine, the distinct metallic clink of a gun being cocked. His heart sank. This was worse than he had anticipated. They weren't just coming to scare him, they were ready to finish this, permanently. He could feel it in his bones. He peered around the edge of the crates, just enough to catch a glimpse of the two figures entering the warehouse. Their faces were shadowed, but Jonathan recognized them instantly: Officer Baker and Officer Randolph. They were both dressed in plain clothes, but the authority in their stance and the violence in their eyes was unmistakable. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from years of unchecked power, from knowing they could get away with anything. These were not just corrupt cops, they were men with something to lose. Jonathan had enough evidence to destroy them, and they knew it. That's why they were here, hunting him down in the dead of night. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a carefully orchestrated hit. Baker's voice rang out, echoing through the empty space. "Blake, we know you're in here." He took a few steps further into the warehouse, his footsteps deliberate, slow, like a predator stalking its prey. "Come out, and we can talk this through. No need for things to get messy." Jonathan didn't move. He stayed crouched, his muscles tensed, his breath held. He knew better than to believe them. There would be no talking, no negotiation. They had already made up their minds. He was a threat, and threats had to be eliminated. He had seen it too many times before, heard too many stories from families whose loved ones had disappeared or accidentally been killed after similar encounters with the police. Randolph spoke next, his voice cold and detached. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Blake. You think you're some kind of hero? Exposing us is only going to bring more trouble down on you. And for what? A few people might know the truth, but you'll be dead, and nothing will change." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He could hear the contempt dripping from Randolph's words, the arrogance of a man who had spent too long bending the law to his will. But it was more than that. There was a quiet fury in his voice, a personal edge. Jonathan had crossed a line, and now Randolph was going to make him pay for it. The two officers moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps echoing off the metal walls. Baker had his gun drawn, sweeping it back and forth, as if expecting Jonathan to leap out from the shadows at any moment. Randolph was more casual, his hands in his pockets, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every corner of the room. Jonathan knew he couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later they would find him. He needed to act fast. He had to create a diversion, something to buy him time, to shift the balance of power, even if only for a few minutes. His eyes darted around the warehouse, searching for anything he could use. Then he saw an old metal pipe, rusted but sturdy, lying just a few feet away. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He grabbed it, his fingers trembling slightly as they closed around the cold metal. He took a deep breath, his mind racing through his options. He could try to attack them, take them by surprise, maybe knock one of them out before the other had time to react. It was risky, but it was all he had. He had no illusions about winning a fair fight. These men were trained, armed, and ready to kill. But if he could disarm them, even for a moment, it might be enough to get out alive. Jonathan waited, crouching lower behind the crates, as Baker and Randolph drew closer. He could hear their breathing now, could see the tension in their movements. They were on edge, too. They weren't used to being in situations they couldn't control. That gave Jonathan a sliver of hope. They weren't invincible, not here, not now. Baker's voice cut through the silence again. "Blake, I'm giving you one last chance. Come out, or we'll come in there and drag you out ourselves." Jonathan's grip tightened on the pipe. He knew what he had to do. He just needed to wait for the right moment. As Baker and Randolph rounded the corner, Jonathan made his move. He sprang from his hiding place, swinging the pipe with all the strength he could muster. The element of surprise worked in his favor. Baker barely had time to react before the pipe connected with his arm, sending his gun flying out of his hand. But Randolph was faster. Before Jonathan could follow through with another strike, Randolph slammed into him, knocking the pipe out of his hand and driving him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment everything went black. He could feel the cold concrete against his face, could hear the sound of Baker cursing as he scrambled to retrieve his gun. Randolph's knee pressed into Jonathan's back, pinning him to the ground. "You really thought you could take us on?" he sneered, his voice low and filled with venom. "You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Jonathan struggled beneath him, but it was no use. Randolph was too strong, too heavy. He could feel the weight of defeat settling over him like a thick fog. This was it. He had tried, but he had failed. Baker's footsteps echoed as he approached, his gun back in his hand. "This could have been so much easier," Blakey said, his voice tinged with amusement. "But you had to go and make it difficult." Jonathan's mind raced. He couldn't give up. Not now. Not like this. He had to do something, anything. But before he could act, a sound cut through the tension, a sound that froze everyone in place. A car engine, faint but growing louder, approached the warehouse. It wasn't the sedan from earlier. It was someone else. Someone unexpected. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He didn't know who it was, but they might be his only chance. He just had to hold on a little longer. Baker and Randolph exchanged glances, their faces darkening with anger. They hadn't planned for this. They hadn't expected anyone else to show up. Jonathan could feel the tension shift. The power dynamic was changing, and for the first time that night, he felt a flicker of hope. Jonathan's body ached from the force of Randolph's knee pressing into his back. The concrete beneath him felt cold and unforgiving, a stark contrast to the heat of his own breath against the ground. His mind raced, searching for any way out, but the weight of defeat felt suffocating. He tried to move, but every attempt was met with more pressure from Randolph, who seemed to enjoy seeing him struggle. Randolph leaned closer, his voice low and taunting. "I hope you're enjoying this, Blake. It didn't have to be like this, you know. You could have kept quiet, gone on living your life. But no, you had to go and play hero." Jonathan clenched his teeth, refusing to respond. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing him beg or plead. Even now, with the weight of defeat pressing on his chest, he wasn't going to let them break him. But the sound of the approaching car had shifted something in the air. Baker and Randolph, who moments ago seemed completely in control, were now glancing toward the entrance of the warehouse, their expressions hardening with uncertainty. They hadn't expected anyone else. This wasn't part of their plan. "Who the hell is that?" Baker hissed, his gun still in hand, but his attention now divided between Jonathan and the newcomer. Randolph shifted his weight slightly, allowing Jonathan to draw in a deeper breath, but the pressure remained. He wasn't letting up, not yet. "It's probably just some drunk or lost driver," Randolph muttered, but there was an edge to his voice. He didn't sound convinced. The car came closer, the headlights cutting through the broken windows of the warehouse. Jonathan strained his neck to see, but from his position on the ground, all he could make out was the silhouette of a vehicle, a large SUV, its engine rumbling softly as it idled just outside the warehouse. Baker's grip on his gun tightened. "We need to get this over with. Now." Randolph hesitated for a moment, then glanced down at Jonathan with a sneer. "Fine. Let's finish this." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the moments slipping away, the brief flicker of hope from the approaching vehicle starting to fade. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to happen fast. He knew he only had seconds to act, seconds to do something, anything to survive. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jonathan twisted his body beneath Randolph, throwing him off balance just enough to create a small gap between them. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Jonathan to roll to the side and push himself up onto his hands and knees. "Damn it," Randolph cursed, reaching for Jonathan, but before he could grab him, The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the warehouse, drawing both officers' attention. Jonathan didn't waste the opportunity. He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him, but he managed to stand. His eyes darted toward the entrance, where the SUV's headlights still shone brightly. The door had opened, but the driver remained in the shadows, just out of sight. Baker raised his gun, pointing it directly at Jonathan's chest. "Don't even think about running, Blake." Jonathan froze, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. He knew that one wrong move could end with a bullet in his back. He was out of options, and Baker knew it. But then, from the shadows, a voice cut through the tension, calm, steady, and unfamiliar. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Officer Baker." Baker's head snapped toward the voice, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure stepping into the light. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his gun still trained on Jonathan. The figure stepped forward, and Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. It was Chris, his old friend, the man he hadn't seen in years, the man he thought he'd lost contact with for good. Chris, the man who had always been there in the background, quietly supporting Jonathan's efforts but never getting directly involved. Until now. Chris stood tall, his hands at his sides, but there was a quiet confidence in his posture that immediately drew attention. He was dressed casually, in dark jeans and a leather jacket, but there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, that made it clear he wasn't just an ordinary passerby. "I said," Chris repeated, his voice calm but firm, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Baker's eyes flicked between Chris and Jonathan, the uncertainty growing in his expression. He didn't lower his gun, but the hesitation was palpable. "You've got no idea what you're walking into," Pal Baker snarled. "This has nothing to do with you." Chris's gaze never wavered. "I think it has everything to do with me." Jonathan could feel the tension building like a coiled spring. He didn't know how Chris had found him or why he was here now, but the fact that he was here at all meant that something had shifted. He wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. Randolph, still standing behind Jonathan, took a step forward, his hand moving toward the holster at his waist. "You need to walk away. Right now," he growled, his eyes locked on Chris. "You have no idea what's going on here." Chris smiled slightly, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was going on and who had no intention of backing down. "Actually, Randolph," he said, his tone casual, almost conversational, "I know exactly what's going on. And so does Internal Affairs." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Baker's face paled, his grip on the gun faltering for just a fraction of a second. "What the hell are you talking about?" Chris took another step forward, and this time, Jonathan saw the glint of something in his hand, his badge. "Special Agent Christopher Harper, Internal Affairs," Chris said, his voice steady. "And I've been watching you two for a long time." Jonathan's mind reeled. Internal Affairs. Chris had been with Internal Affairs all this time. The realization hit him like a wave, but before he could process it, the situation around him erupted into chaos. Randolph's face twisted into a snarl, his hand going for his gun. "You son of a..." But Chris was faster. In one smooth motion, he pulled his own weapon from beneath his jacket, aiming it squarely at Randolph's chest. "I wouldn't," Chris warned, his voice deadly calm. "You're out of options." Baker, still holding his gun on Jonathan, looked between Chris and Randolph, his mind clearly racing. "You're bluffing," he spat. "There's no way you've been watching us." Chris's eyes never left Randolph. I've got enough evidence to put you both away for the rest of your lives. Assault, corruption, intimidation, you name it. I've got it. So here's how this is going to go. You're going to lower your weapons, and you're going to walk out of here with me. Or you can try to shoot your way out, but I promise you won't make it far. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was suffocating, the warehouse filled with the sound of heavy breathing and the distant hum of the SUV's engine. Then, slowly, Baker lowered his gun. Randolph, still furious, hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, but eventually he too let his hand fall away from his weapon. Jonathan's knees nearly gave out from relief, but he forced himself to stay standing, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline continued to surge through his veins. Chris didn't relax. His gun remained trained on the two officers as he gestured toward the exit. Move. Baker and Randolph exchanged glances, but they knew they had no choice. Slowly they began to walk toward the exit, their shoulders tense with the knowledge that their careers and their freedom were hanging by a thread. Chris waited until they were out of sight before lowering his weapon and turning to Jonathan. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had just happened hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Finally, Jonathan found his voice. You've been watching them." Chris nodded. "For months. We've been building a case against them and a lot of other people in the department. Tonight was supposed to be the night we moved in, but when I saw that they were following you..." He shook his head, his expression grim. "I couldn't wait any longer." Jonathan exhaled slowly, the enormity of the situation sinking in. He had known he was in danger, but he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption ran. And now, standing here in the middle of an abandoned warehouse, he understood that this was only the beginning. The cold night air filled the empty warehouse as Chris and Jonathan stood in silence, the weight of everything that had just transpired pressing down on them. The once oppressive atmosphere had shifted, but the tension was far from gone. Jonathan's body still ached from the beating he had taken, and his mind raced, trying to process the rapid turn of events. Chris had been working for internal affairs. He had been watching Baker, Randolph, and others in the department for months. All of this time, Jonathan had been fighting against a system he thought was invincible, unaware that someone on the inside was already building a case against them. But as relieved as he was to know that Chris had his back, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. "They're not going to go down quietly," Jonathan said, his voice rough from the pain. He looked toward the exit, where Baker and Randolph had just left. "They'll try to turn this around on us. You know that." Chris nodded grimly, his jaw clenched. "I know. That's why we need to move fast." Jonathan took a deep breath, steadying himself. The adrenaline was still coursing through his veins, but the exhaustion was setting in. He could feel the bruises forming on his ribs, the ache in his arms where Randolph had pinned him to the ground. But he couldn't stop now. If anything, the events of the night had only solidified his resolve. "What's the plan?" Jonathan asked, his voice firm despite the pain. "How do we take them down?" Chris hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the warehouse as if he were calculating every possible outcome. "I've already sent a message to my team," he said. "They're on their way to secure the area. But it's not just Baker and Randolph. We're dealing with an entire network of corrupt cops people who have been covering each other's tracks for years. Taking down these two is just the beginning." Jonathan's stomach tightened. He had known there was corruption in the department, but the idea of a network, an organized effort to protect the worst of the worst, was almost too much to bear. And now, with everything out in the open, the danger had only multiplied. "They'll retaliate," Jonathan said, his voice low. "They won't let this go." Chris looked at him, his expression serious. "That's why we need to stay ahead of them. We can't give them any time to regroup." Jonathan nodded, but a gnawing sense of unease remained. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Baker and Randolph might have been cornered, but they weren't the kind of men to back down easily. And with the rest of the network still intact, there was no telling what lengths they would go to in order to protect themselves. Chris's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out, his eyes narrowing as he read the message. "My team's here," he said, slipping the phone back into his jacket. "We need to get out of here. They'll handle Baker and Randolph." Jonathan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. At least for now, the immediate threat had passed. But as he and Chris started toward the exit, a new wave of anxiety hit him. The documents. The files he had compiled, the evidence he had gathered against Baker and his network, it was still in his car. And if Baker or Randolph had gotten their hands on it? Jonathan's steps quickened. "I need to get to my car," he said, his voice urgent. "The evidence is in there." Chris frowned, quickening his pace to match Jonathan's. "What kind of evidence?" "Everything," Jonathan said, his heart racing. "Testimonies, video footage, leaked documents from inside the department. If they get their hands on it." "They won't," Chris interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "My team's covering all the exits. We'll get to your car before they do." But Jonathan's mind was already racing through worst-case scenarios. What if Baker and Randolph had doubled back? What if they had already reached the car? He couldn't afford to lose that evidence. It was his only leverage. Without it, everything he had worked for could crumble in an instant. As they reached the exit of the warehouse, the night air hit them like a wall. The SUV that Chris had arrived in was still parked outside, its engine idling softly. Across the street, Jonathan could see two black sedans vehicles he assumed belonged to Chris's team blocking the road. There was no sign of Baker or Randolph. Jonathan's eyes darted to his own car, parked a few yards away. Relief flooded through him as he saw that it was untouched, the briefcase still resting on the passenger seat where he had left it. He broke into a jog, his footsteps echoing in the quiet street. But just as he reached for the door handle, a voice stopped him cold. "You really think it's that easy, Blake?" Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He turned slowly, his eyes widening as he saw Baker and Randolph stepping out from behind one of the black sedans. Their faces were twisted with fury, and Baker's gun was once again trained on Jonathan's chest. "You don't get to walk away from this," Baker snarled, his voice trembling with rage. "Not after everything you've done." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He glanced toward Chris, who had his own gun raised, but the situation had changed. Randolph had drawn his weapon as well, and both men were clearly prepared for a fight. "You should have stayed quiet," Randolph spat, his eyes glinting with malice. "You should have kept your mouth shut, and none of this would have happened." Jonathan's mind raced. He had been so close to escaping, so close to bringing these men to justice. But now, with the two officers standing between him and the evidence, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Chris took a step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Put the guns down, both of you. This is over." But Baker shook his head, his eyes wild. No, this isn't over. Not by a long shot." Jonathan could feel the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. One wrong move, one twitch of a finger, and the situation would spiral out of control. His mind raced through his options, but there were none. He was trapped, and he knew it. And then, without warning, Baker fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the street like a thunderclap, and Jonathan felt a searing pain in his side as the bullet tore through him. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, the world spinning around him. Chris's voice sounded distant, muffled by the ringing in Jonathan's ears. He tried to move, tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. The pain in his side was overwhelming, and his vision blurred as he struggled to stay conscious. Through the haze of pain, Jonathan could hear the sound of more gunfire, sharp, quick bursts as Chris exchanged shots with Baker and Randolph, but it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. All Jonathan could focus on was the pain, the blood soaking through his shirt, and the growing realization that he might not survive this. The darkness at the edges of his vision crept closer, and for a moment, Jonathan considered letting go. He was so tired of fighting, tired of running, tired of being hunted. Maybe it would be easier to just let it all end. But then, through the fog of pain, he remembered the evidence. The briefcase. The files. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for it was all still within reach, and if he gave up now it would be for nothing. With a Herculean effort, Jonathan forced his eyes open. His hand, trembling and slick with blood, reached out toward the briefcase. It was only a few feet away, just out of reach. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain, and dragged himself forward inch by inch. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his body, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, his fingers brushed against the edge of the briefcase, and he gripped it tightly, pulling it toward him. As his vision darkened once again, Jonathan clutched the briefcase to his chest, the evidence safe in his grasp. And with that thought, the world went black. Jonathan was floating in a fog of pain. The world around him had faded to a dull hum, the sharp sound of gunfire distant, like an echo from another lifetime. His body was heavy, and every breath sent waves of agony rippling through his chest. The briefcase in his arms felt like an anchor, grounding him to the one thing that mattered, the truth. But the darkness was relentless, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel his consciousness slipping, his grip on the briefcase loosening. The edges of his vision blurred, and for a moment he thought it might be easier to just let go. Then, a voice cut through the fog. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, more urgent. "Jonathan, stay with me." It was Chris. Jonathan blinked, forcing his eyes open, though the pain made it nearly impossible. The world came back into focus in fragments, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, the cold asphalt beneath him, the blood seeping through his shirt. And there was Chris, crouched beside him, his face etched with concern. "Jonathan, can you hear me?" Chris's voice was sharp, his hands pressing against the wound in Jonathan's side, trying to stem the bleeding. Jonathan's lips moved, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his body trembling with the effort to stay conscious. He managed a weak nod, though the pain made even that small movement feel like torture. Chris's face softened with relief, but there was no time to rest. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped him back into action. He looked over his shoulder, his hand instinctively moving to the gun holstered at his side. Baker and Randolph were still standing, though they looked worse for wear. Baker's arm was bleeding, a dark stain spreading across the sleeve of his jacket. Randolph's face was twisted in fury, his eyes locked on Chris and Jonathan with a murderous intensity. "You're not getting out of this alive," Baker snarled, his voice low and venomous. His gun was still in his hand, though his grip was shaky. He was hurt, but not enough to stop him. Chris's mind raced. He couldn't fight both of them and keep Jonathan safe at the same time. He needed backup now, but his team was still en route, and there was no guarantee they'd make it in time. "We're running out of options," Chris muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking between Baker and Randolph. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, the sense that everything was about to come crashing down. The situation was spiraling out of control. Jonathan's hand tightened around the briefcase, his body trembling from the effort. The evidence inside was the only thing keeping him grounded, the only thing worth fighting for. But if Baker and Randolph got their hands on it, everything would be lost. Chris knew that too. He glanced down at Jonathan, his jaw set in determination. "I won't let them take it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. But Randolph was already moving, stepping closer with his gun raised, his eyes wild with rage. "Hand it over," he growled. "You give me that case, and maybe I'll let you live long enough to say your goodbyes." Chris's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice steady. "You kill us, and you'll never make it out of here." "My team's on the way. It's over, Randolph." Randolph's lips curled into a sneer. "You think I care? You think I'm afraid of your team? I've been doing this for years. I know how this game works." Baker, still clutching his bleeding arm, took a step forward, his gun aimed at Jonathan. "We should have finished this earlier," he said, his voice filled with cold malice. "But don't worry, we'll fix that now." Chris's muscles tensed. He could see the hatred in Baker's eyes, the twisted sense of superiority that had driven men like him for years. Baker and Randolph didn't just want to win, they wanted to destroy. They wanted to make an example out of Jonathan, to send a message to anyone else who dared to stand up to them. And Chris couldn't let that happen. In one fluid motion, Chris drew his gun and fired. The shot echoed through the street, and Baker's body jerked as the bullet struck him in the shoulder. His gun clattered to the ground, and he stumbled back, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. "Damn it," Randolph shouted, his grip on his own gun tightening as he raised it toward Chris. But Chris was already moving, his training kicking in as he ducked behind the nearest car for cover. Randolph fired, the shots ringing out in quick succession, but they missed their mark, striking the pavement where Chris had stood just seconds before. Jonathan lay on the ground, his vision blurring again as the pain in his side intensified. He could hear the gunfire, the shouts, but they felt distant, like they were happening to someone else. He knew he was running out of time, if he didn't get medical attention soon. But there was no time to think about that. His fingers still gripped the briefcase, and he knew he had to protect it at all costs. Randolph's voice cut through the chaos, filled with rage. "You can't hide forever, Harper. We'll find you, and when we do, you're dead." Chris ignored him, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. He was running low on ammunition, and Randolph was getting more desperate by the second. The only advantage Chris had was that Randolph didn't know how close his team was. It was a bluff, but it might be enough to buy them a few more minutes. Randolph fired again, the bullets ricocheting off the cars parked along the street. Chris ducked lower, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He needed to get to Jonathan, needed to get them both out of this alive. But before he could make his move, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Chris's heart leapt. His team was here. Randolph heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, his eyes widening in panic. "No," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wail of the sirens. "No, This can't be happening. Chris took advantage of the distraction. He popped up from behind the car, his gun trained on Randolph. "Drop the gun," he shouted, his voice filled with authority. "It's over." Randolph's hand shook, his grip on the gun loosening as the reality of the situation finally hit him. The sirens grew louder, closer, and Chris could see the flashing lights of the approaching vehicles. For a moment, it looked like Randolph was going to surrender. His shoulders slumped and his gun lowered slightly. But then, with a roar of frustration, Randolph turned and fired one last shot, this time at Jonathan. The world seemed to slow as Chris watched in horror. He was too far away, he couldn't stop it. The bullet flew through the air, and there was nothing he could do. But before the shot could connect, Jonathan's body was already rolling to the side. In the chaos of the moment, driven by pure instinct, Jonathan had somehow managed to move just enough to avoid the fatal shot. The bullet struck the pavement next to him, sending shards of concrete flying into the air. Chris didn't hesitate. He fired once, twice, and Randolph's body crumpled to the ground, his gun slipping from his fingers. For a moment, there was silence. The sirens still wailed in the distance, but the immediate threat was over. Chris rushed to Jonathan's side, his heart pounding in his chest. "Jonathan," he called, his voice thick with worry. "Jonathan, are you okay?" Jonathan's eyes fluttered open, his face pale from blood loss. I'm still here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Chris let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You're going to be okay," he said, though the words felt hollow. Jonathan had lost too much blood, and Chris knew they didn't have much time. The flashing lights of the approaching police vehicles bathed the street in red and blue, and Chris could hear the sound of doors slamming, the hurried footsteps of his team rushing toward them. "Get a medic," Chris shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "He's losing too much blood." One of the agents nodded and sprinted toward the van parked nearby, while the others moved to secure Baker and Randolph. Baker was still alive, though barely, and he was quickly handcuffed and hauled into the back of one of the patrol cars. Randolph's body lay motionless on the ground, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Chris stayed by Jonathan's side, his hands pressed against the wound in a desperate attempt to slow the bleeding. "You're not going anywhere," Chris muttered, his voice tight with emotion. "You hear me? You're going to make it through this." Jonathan managed a weak smile, though it quickly faded as the pain overtook him again. The briefcase," he whispered. Chris looked down, his heart clenching as he saw the briefcase still clutched tightly in Jonathan's hands. Even in the face of death, Jonathan had never let go of it. "You did it," Chris said softly. "You kept it safe." The medics arrived a moment later, rushing to Jonathan's side. Chris stepped back, giving them room to work, though his eyes never left Jonathan's face. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, Jonathan's hand slipped from the briefcase, and Chris caught it before it hit the ground. He held it tightly, knowing that this evidence was everything Jonathan had fought for. As the medics loaded Jonathan into the ambulance, Chris stood there, the briefcase in his hand, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. Baker and Randolph were finished. The network they had built would crumble. But Jonathan's fight wasn't over yet. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway buzzed overhead as Chris paced back and forth, his mind racing. He hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours, and the weight of the briefcase in his hand seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. The evidence inside had the power to bring down an entire network of corrupt cops, but none of that mattered right now. All Chris could think about was Jonathan, who was fighting for his life just a few doors down. The doctors had rushed him into surgery the moment they arrived at the hospital, and Chris had been left to wait powerless, exhausted, and angry. The shootout with Baker and Randolph was over, but the real battle had just begun. Jonathan had risked everything to expose the truth, and now his life was hanging by a thread. Chris stopped pacing for a moment, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't shake the image of Jonathan lying on the pavement, bleeding out while still clutching the briefcase. Even in his weakest moment, Jonathan had refused to let go of the one thing that could bring justice to his community. It was a level of courage that Chris had rarely seen, even among the bravest agents he had worked with. A door opened behind him, and Chris spun around, his heart skipping a beat. It was one of the doctors, her expression somber but calm. "How is he?" Chris asked, his voice tight with tension. The doctor removed her mask, sighing softly. "He's stable, but it was close. The bullet did a lot of damage. He lost a significant amount of blood. We were able to repair the damage, but he's not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours will be critical." Chris nodded, swallowing hard. He wanted to ask more questions, but his mind was too scattered. The relief that Jonathan was still alive, mixed with the anxiety that he wasn't out of danger, made it hard to focus on anything else. "Can I see him?" Chris asked. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He's unconscious, but you can go in for a few minutes." Chris thanked her and moved toward the door to Jonathan's room, his heart heavy with a mixture of emotions. The room was dimly lit, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound breaking the silence. Jonathan lay still in the bed, his face pale, his body connected to various machines and IV drips. Chris pulled up a chair beside the bed, setting the briefcase down at his feet. For a long moment he just sat there, staring at his friend, wondering how they had ended up here. He had known Jonathan for years, known him as a man of unshakable conviction, a man who never backed down, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. But seeing him like this, vulnerable and broken, brought a wave of guilt crashing over Chris. He should have been there sooner. He should have stopped this before it escalated to this point. "I'm sorry," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. "I should have done more." He didn't expect an answer, but the silence only deepened his sense of responsibility. Jonathan had done his part. He had gathered the evidence, stood up to corruption, and paid the price. Now it was up to Chris to finish what Jonathan had started. The door creaked open behind him, and Chris turned to see one of his agents, Agent Rivera, standing in the doorway. "Chris," Rivera said softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." Chris stood up, nodding. He glanced back at Jonathan, then followed Rivera out into the hallway. "What's the status?" Chris asked, his voice firm but tired. Rivera handed him a tablet with several files open on the screen. "We've got Baker in custody. He's already lawyered up, but we're holding him on multiple charges: attempted murder, corruption, conspiracy. Randolph's dead, as you know, and we've recovered several key pieces of evidence from both their vehicles." Chris scrolled through the documents on the tablet, his eyes narrowing as he read through the reports. The case was stronger than it had ever been, but there were still gaps that needed to be filled. And with Baker still alive, there was always a chance that he would try to worm his way out of it. "What about the rest of the network?" Chris asked, his voice cold. "We can't just stop with Baker. There are others higher-ups who've been covering for them. We need to take them all down." Rivera nodded, her expression grim. "We're working on it. The evidence Jonathan gathered is enough to open an investigation into at least 5 other officers in the department. But it's going to take time to get the full picture. These guys are good at covering their tracks." Chris clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Every second that passed gave the corrupt officers more room to maneuver, more chances to destroy evidence and close ranks. They couldn't afford to drag this out. "We need to move faster," Chris said, his voice hard. "We can't let them slip away. Jonathan nearly died for this. He doesn't have time, and neither do we." Rivera nodded again, her face set in determination. "We'll get it done, Chris. I promise." Chris handed the tablet back to her, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He knew that the next few days would be critical. If they didn't act swiftly, everything Jonathan had fought for could be lost. "Keep me updated," Chris said, his tone brooking no argument. "I want to know the second we have anything actionable." Rivera left, and Chris was alone again, the silence of the hospital corridor pressing in on him. He leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. The exhaustion was catching up to him, but he couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. He turned back toward Jonathan's room, his mind churning with thoughts of what came next. The fight wasn't over. They had won a battle tonight, but the war was still raging, and Chris knew that the people they were up against wouldn't go down without a fight. As he entered the room again, he looked at Jonathan, still unconscious but alive. The briefcase sat at his feet, the contents inside it the key to taking down an entire system of corruption. Chris picked up the briefcase, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let this end here. Jonathan had risked his life for the truth, and now it was Chris's job to make sure that truth saw the light of day. "I'll finish this," Chris whispered, his voice filled with determination. "I swear to you, Jonathan, I'll finish this." With one last look at his friend, Chris turned and left the room. He had a war to win. A week had passed since the events that nearly took Jonathan's life. The hospital room was brighter now, filled with sunlight streaming through the large windows. The sterile scent of antiseptic still hung in the air, but there was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. Jonathan lay in the bed, awake but still weak, his body slowly recovering from the ordeal. His bandages were a stark reminder of how close he had come to dying. Chris sat in a chair by his side, the same briefcase that had been with them through everything resting on his lap. The tension of the past few days had eased slightly, but the weight of the fight still loomed over both men. "You did it," Jonathan said, his voice hoarse but steady. He looked at Chris with a faint smile, his eyes reflecting the deep gratitude he felt. "You brought them down." Chris nodded, but there was no victory in his eyes. "We got Baker," he said, his voice low. "Randolph is gone. A few others have been arrested, but there's still more work to do. You know that." Jonathan shifted slightly in his bed, wincing from the pain that still radiated from his wounds. "I know, but it's a start. And that's more than we had before." Chris looked down at the briefcase in his lap, running his fingers over the worn leather. Inside was everything Jonathan had risked his life for: testimonies, documents, videos. It was the key to exposing the full extent of the corruption within the police department. But even with Baker in custody, Chris knew that the battle was far from over. "The higher-ups are still trying to cover their tracks," Chris said, his frustration evident. "They're throwing Baker under the bus, trying to make it look like he was the ringleader. But we know it goes deeper than that. The entire system is rotten." Jonathan nodded, his expression somber. "It always has been. But that's why we fight. We can't stop now." The room fell silent for a moment, both men lost in their own thoughts. The road ahead was long, and they both knew that taking down Baker and Randolph was only the beginning. There were others, powerful people who would do anything to keep the truth from coming out. "How's the community reacting?" Jonathan asked, breaking the silence. Chris sighed. "They're angry. But more than that, They're scared. They've known about the corruption for years, but seeing it exposed like this, it's shaken them. Some people are starting to speak out, though. Your work is making a difference. Jonathan's smile widened slightly. That's what mattered to him, the people. His community had suffered under the weight of systemic corruption for so long, and now, finally, they were beginning to see that change was possible. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but the first cracks had formed in the walls of injustice that had stood for decades. I'm going to keep pushing, Jonathan said, his voice filled with quiet determination. When I'm out of here, I'll keep fighting. We'll take down the rest of them, no matter how long it takes. Chris leaned forward, his gaze steady. You're not doing this alone. We're in this together. Jonathan's eyes met Chris's, and in that moment there was a silent understanding between them. They had both sacrificed so much, Jonathan nearly his life, and Chris his career as an undercover agent. But neither of them had any intention of backing down. The door to the room opened, and a nurse stepped in, offering a warm smile as she checked Jonathan's vitals. You've made a lot of progress, she said kindly. I think you'll be out of here sooner than you think. Jonathan chuckled softly, though the movement made his chest ache. That's good to hear. I'm not much for sitting still. Chris smiled faintly, but his mind was already racing ahead. There were meetings with internal affairs to prepare for, new arrests to make, and more investigations to open. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. They had taken the first step, and now it was up to them to see it through. As the nurse left the room, Jonathan looked back at Chris, his expression serious. What about the media, he asked. Do they know what's really going on? Chris hesitated for a moment. They know some of it. The stories out there, corrupt cops, an assassination attempt on you, but the real depth of the corruption. That's still coming to light. Once we have everything lined up, the truth will be impossible to ignore. Jonathan nodded, satisfied with the answer. Good. We need the world to see what's been happening here. We need them to understand that this isn't just about me, it's about everyone. Chris stood up, picking up the briefcase as he did. I'll make sure they do. You just focus on getting better. We'll need you when the dust settles. Jonathan smiled again, a real smile this time, filled with hope and determination. I'm not going anywhere. Chris headed for the door. But before he left, he turned back to Jonathan one last time. You're a fighter, Jonathan, and we're going to win this. I promise. With that, Chris walked out of the room, the briefcase in hand and the weight of their shared mission pressing down on him once again. The fight wasn't over, but they had made it through the first battle. And now, with the evidence in their hands and the truth on their side, they were ready to take on whatever came next. As Jonathan lay back against the pillows, he let out a long breath. The road ahead would be harder than anything he had faced before. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. For the first time, in a long time, he felt hope.